The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet, sour kind that seeps into carpets and never leaves. I was seated at the far end of the polished oak table, close enough to hear every word, far enough to be forgotten. That had always been my position. Peripheral, optional, invisible when convenient. Across from me, my brother-in-law laughed too loudly, the sound sharp and rehearsed, as if he were auditioning for confidence. My sister sat beside him, fingers wrapped tightly around a paper cup, her knuckles pale. The others, cousins, board members, people who shared our last name but not our loyalty, shifted in their seats, eyes flicking toward the exit like animals sensing a fire before the smoke arrived. Someone cleared their throat. "We don't have a choice," my brother-in-law said, spreading his hands as if surrendering to fate. "The market's turned. Cash is king now. We sell what we can. Survive the year." Survive. The word hung there, heavy and fragile. It was spoken like a virtue. No one looked at me. They were too busy sliding documents across the table. Share transfer forms, resignation letters, quiet confessions of fear printed in black ink. One by one, they signed away pieces of something they'd inherited, never built, and barely understood. My sister glanced at me then. Just for a second. Her eyes were pleading, embarrassed, almost apologetic. As if she wanted to say, "You understand, right?" As if I'd ever been invited to understand anything. I gave her nothing. Just a small nod. Neutral. Polite. Inside, my heart was pounding so hard I was afraid it would give me away. Because they didn't know what I had already done. It hadn't always been this way. This room, this company, this brittle sense of entitlement that passed for family unity. Once, long before balance sheets replaced birthday cards, I'd believed in us. Or maybe I'd just believed in my place among them. That illusion cracked years earlier, the day my name was left off an email thread titled Future Stakeholders. I remembered staring at the screen, refreshing it like a fool, convinced it was a mistake. I was working 2 jobs then, helping my mother, paying my own way, watching everyone else glide forward on the rails of inherited certainty. When I asked about it, I was met with smiles, soft voices, reassurances that didn't quite land. "Oh, it's just procedural. You know how these things are. We didn't think you'd be interested." Interested. What I didn't realize then was that exclusion isn't always loud. Sometimes it's gentle, administrative, wrapped in professionalism, so clean it almost looks kind. From that moment on, I learned to listen more than I spoke, to observe who leaned forward when money was mentioned, who went silent when risk appeared, who panicked first, and who forgot. Back in the conference room, the conversation moved quickly, nervously. Numbers were thrown around like life preservers. Losses exaggerated. Timelines shortened. Fear had a way of compressing the future until only today mattered. "I'll sell half," one cousin said, his voice cracking just enough to reveal the truth beneath the bravado. "All of it for me," another added. "I can't afford to wait." Wait. That word tasted bitter. Because waiting had been my entire life. I thought of the nights I'd stayed up reading shareholder reports no one else bothered with. The footnotes. The quiet disclosures buried under pages of noise. I thought of the meetings I wasn't invited to, where decisions were made hastily, emotionally, without memory. What I didn't realize at the time, what they still didn't, was how predictable panic could be. Dividends weren't glamorous. They didn't trend. They didn't make headlines. They arrived quietly, consistently, like a clock no one checked anymore. And in the rush toward liquidity, they'd become invisible. Forgotten. The irony almost made me smile. Almost. My brother-in-law leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the momentum. "We'll reconvene next quarter," he said. Assuming we're still standing. A few nervous laughs followed. Relief. The illusion of control restored. That was when I spoke. "I'm not selling," I said softly. The room stilled. Every head turned, startled, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly developed an opinion. "Sorry," my brother-in-law asked, blinking. "I'm holding my shares," I repeated. Calm. Measured. All of them. Silence stretched. Someone shifted uncomfortably. I could feel the weight of their stares pressing into my skin, searching for weakness, for ignorance, for a reason to dismiss me. "That's risky," my sister said gently. Too gently. "The way you speak to someone you think doesn't understand the stakes." "I know," I replied. What I didn't say was that risk had already been calculated. Modeled. Stress-tested. That I'd run the numbers a dozen times, adjusting for worst-case scenarios they hadn't even considered. What I didn't realize then was how deeply my refusal unsettled them. Not because it threatened the company, but because it challenged the story they told themselves about who I was. The meeting ended shortly after. Papers gathered. Chairs scraped. People avoided my eyes. As I stood to leave, my brother-in-law stopped me near the door. His smile was tight, brittle at the edges. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. "There's no shame in protecting yourself." I met his gaze. Held it. "I am protecting myself," I said. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Suit yourself." I walked out without looking back, my hands trembling just enough to remind me I was human. What I didn't realize then was that this was the moment everything shifted. Not because of what I said, but because of what I refused to do. And as they rushed to survive, selling pieces of a future they no longer believed in, I went home and opened my laptop. The dividend statement was already there, waiting. Unchanged. Unmoved. Patient. And for the first time, I wondered how long it would take before they noticed what they'd forgotten, and what it would cost them when they did. The numbers glowed softly on my screen that night, steady and unbothered by the chaos unfolding elsewhere. I stared at them longer than I needed to, not because I didn't understand them, but because I did. Each line told a story no one else had bothered to read. A story about patience, about compounding, about rewards that favored those who stayed silent while others panicked. What I didn't realize then was how alone that knowledge would make me. I closed the laptop and leaned back on my couch, the springs sighing under my weight. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. No shared walls buzzing with voices. No family group chat lighting up my phone with forced optimism and thinly veiled fear. I'd stopped participating in those months ago. It was easier to observe from the outside. Safer. My phone buzzed anyway. "Sister, are you awake?" I didn't answer right away. I knew what was coming. Concern wrapped in condescension. Love tangled with disbelief. "Sister, I don't want you getting hurt." There it was. I typed slowly. "Me, I won't." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "Sister, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." I almost laughed. Almost. Because proving things was the one thing I'd never been allowed to do. My competence had always been theoretical to them. Possible in concept, improbable in reality. Me, I know. I set the phone face down and let the silence return. What I didn't realize then was that this silence, the space where no one asked my opinion, no one trusted my judgment, had been my greatest advantage. While they'd been talking over one another for years, I'd been listening. While they chased growth stories and flashy exits, I'd traced the boring lines no one respected enough to question. Dividends weren't exciting. They were old-fashioned, predictable, and deeply unfashionable in rooms full of people who wanted to feel smart. That was exactly why they worked. A week later, the first confirmation arrived. Not with drama. Not with triumph. Just a notification nestled between a grocery receipt and a streaming service reminder. Dividend payment received. I stared at it, my pulse quickening despite myself. It wasn't life-changing money. Not yet. But it was proof. Proof that something still flowed beneath the surface they'd all abandoned. Proof that value didn't vanish just because confidence did. What I didn't realize then was how quickly desperation rewrites memory. The next family gathering was at my mother's house. Sunday afternoon. Roast chicken drying under heat lamps. The same framed photos lining the hallway, weddings, graduations, moments of unity that existed mostly in hindsight. Conversations circled the company like a wound no one wanted to touch directly. "Markets are brutal right now," a cousin said, carving into his plate with unnecessary force. "You hear about what happened to." "Let's not," my mother interrupted softly. "Not today." Everyone nodded. Relief washed over the table. Avoidance masquerading as peace. My sister caught my eye again. Held it longer this time. There was something new there. Not pity. Not concern. Curiosity. "So," she said carefully, "have you reconsidered?" The table quieted. Forks paused midair. I took a sip of water. Let the moment stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. "No," I said. "A beat." "Oh," she replied. "Okay." That was it. No argument. No lecture. Just that one word, weighted with things unsaid. What I didn't realize then was that curiosity would soon turn into something sharper. By the end of the month, the tone shifted. Group messages resurfaced. Casual check-ins from people who hadn't spoken to me directly in years. "Hey, how are you holding up? Crazy times, huh? Still working that job of yours?" They never asked directly. Pride wouldn't allow it. But the questions hovered, circling the truth like moths around a light they didn't want to admit they saw. Another dividend landed. Then another. I tracked them meticulously. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remember every step. Every quiet confirmation that staying put had been the right decision. What I didn't realize then was that someone else was tracking things too. It was my brother-in-law who finally broke. He called late one evening, his voice too upbeat, too rehearsed. "Thought I'd check in," he said. "See how you're doing." "I'm fine," I replied. A pause. "So, you still holding?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. "You know," he said, "there might be opportunities coming up. Buybacks. Restructuring. It's complicated." I smiled into the darkness of my living room. "I'm sure it is." Silence crackled between us. What I didn't realize then was how threatening stability looks to someone who's already jumped. After we hung up, I opened my laptop again. Not to check numbers this time, but to read. Old reports. Archived statements. Notes I'd taken years earlier, dismissed back then as trivia. One line caught my eye. Something I'd underlined long ago. Dividend policy unchanged unless extraordinary circumstances apply. Extraordinary. Fear felt extraordinary when you were in it. But fear wasn't a clause. Panic wasn't a metric. They'd mistaken emotion for inevitability. I closed the document and sat back, a strange calm settling over me. Because I finally understood something I hadn't before. They weren't just selling shares. They were selling time. And I was buying it quietly, payment by payment, while they told themselves survival was the same thing as wisdom. What I didn't realize then, what none of us realized yet, was how much resentment that difference would breed. And how dangerous it would become once they understood exactly what they'd given away. The shift wasn't loud. It never is. Resentment rarely announces itself. It settles in quietly, like dust on furniture no one uses anymore. At first, it was subtle. A tone. A look held a second too long. Conversations that paused when I entered the room. I noticed everything. I always had. At the next board-adjacent gathering, an informal dinner disguised as a catch-up, I took my usual seat near the edge. Same vantage point. Same invisibility they thought they controlled. My brother-in-law was mid-story, performing confidence again. Something about strategic liquidity and weathering the storm. The words flowed smoothly, practiced enough to convince anyone who didn't look too closely. "But we did what we had to," he concluded, lifting his glass. "Survival first." A murmur of agreement followed. Survival. Again. I felt it then, that faint tightening in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Recognition. Because survival was their ceiling. It always had been. My sister leaned toward me, lowering her voice. "You've been quiet." "I'm listening," I said. She studied my face, searching for cracks. For regret. For fear. She found none. What I didn't realize then was how unsettling calm can be to people who've made irreversible choices. A few days later, the email arrived. Subject line. Quick question. No greeting. No context. Just that. It was from one of the cousins who'd sold everything. Every share, every vote, every whisper of future leverage. He'd been the loudest in the meeting. The first to panic. The first to sign. "Hey, I heard something about distribution still going out. Is that true?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. He hadn't even known what he was giving up. Not really. To him, shares were numbers. Assets to liquidate. Things you traded when fear outweighed patience. I typed back carefully. "Yes. According to policy. Nothing more." 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "So you're getting paid?" There it was. The question they'd all been circling without daring to ask. Yes. No apology followed. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just silence. What I didn't realize then was that silence, too, was an answer. The next dividend arrived larger than the last. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I simply recorded it and went on with my day. There was power in that restraint. Power in letting the truth speak for itself. But truth has a way of echoing. By the end of the quarter, whispers had turned into conversations. Conversations into tension. Meetings that once excluded me now mentioned my name. Carefully, indirectly, like something volatile. She didn't sell. She's still holding. She's benefiting. Benefiting. The word carried accusation now. As if patience were a betrayal. As if my refusal to panic had somehow undermined their choice. What I didn't realize then was how quickly people rewrite history when the present becomes uncomfortable. My sister called again, this time during the day. I didn't know, she said without preamble. Didn't know what? That the dividends would keep coming. I closed my eyes. They were always scheduled to, I said gently. She was quiet for a moment. Then, softer. Why didn't you say anything? I almost laughed. Almost. Would it have changed anything? I asked. Another pause. Longer. Heavier. I don't know, she admitted. That was the truth. And it scared her. Because admitting that meant admitting something else. That the decision to sell hadn't been inevitable. That fear, not necessity, had driven it. What I didn't realize then was how dangerous that realization would become once it spread. At the next formal meeting, I was invited to speak. It was framed as inclusion, transparency, a gesture of unity. But I could feel the undercurrent, the scrutiny, the unspoken question hanging over the table. What do you know that we didn't? I took my seat, heart steady, expression neutral. As discussions began, restructuring, cost-cutting, survival plans, I listened. Took notes. Waited. When it was my turn, I spoke carefully. Not to boast. Not to accuse. Just facts. Dividend policy remains unchanged, I said. Cash flow supports it. Long-term projections haven't shifted as dramatically as expected. Faces tightened. Pens stilled. My brother-in-law cleared his throat. That's optimistic. No, I replied softly. It's documented. Silence. What I didn't realize then was that documentation is threatening when it contradicts belief. After the meeting, he pulled me aside. You could have warned us, he said, his voice low, edged with something sharp. I tried, I replied. Years ago. You didn't listen. His jaw tightened. You're benefiting from our loss. I met his gaze. Held it. No, I said. I'm benefiting from my patience. The difference mattered. And he knew it. What I didn't realize then was that this was no longer about money. It was about power. About who had it, and who'd quietly reclaimed it while everyone else was too busy surviving to notice. And as I walked away, I felt it clearly for the first time. This wasn't the end of Act 1. It was the moment they began to understand what they'd forgotten, and what it would cost them to get it back. They didn't confront me all at once. That would have required unity, and unity had cracked the moment fear entered the room months ago. Instead, they came one by one. Quiet messages, side conversations, accidental run-ins that weren't accidents at all. It started with my aunt. She cornered me in the hallway after another family dinner, her perfume too strong, her smile too careful. You've always been good with numbers, she said, like it was a compliment she'd just invented. I nodded, said nothing. I was wondering, she continued, lowering her voice, if you think it would make sense to get back in. If things stabilize. Get back in. As if this were a theater and they'd simply stepped out for air. As far as I know, I said evenly, there's nothing to get back into. You sold. Her smile faltered. Just for a second. Well, yes, but selling is final, I finished gently. She stared at me, searching for sympathy. For flexibility. For an exception carved from family ties. What she found instead was something else. Certainty. What I didn't realize then was how much certainty scares people who've already compromised with themselves. The calls increased after that. Former stakeholders. Relatives. Even people who'd barely acknowledged me before. All with the same careful tone. The same cautious phrasing. Just curious. Hypothetically speaking. Purely academic. They asked about projections. About timelines. About whether dividends might increase. I answered honestly, but never completely. Because what I didn't realize then was that information isn't power. Timing is. And they were already too late. The company's next quarterly report landed like a quiet bomb. Losses hadn't materialized the way everyone had predicted. Revenue streams they'd dismissed as legacy held steady. Cost-cutting measures, implemented too aggressively, had begun to show strain. And the dividend? Still there. Unchanged. I read the report alone, sitting at my kitchen table, sunlight creeping across the floor. My coffee went cold untouched as I traced each line, each confirmation of what I'd known in my bones long before it was printed. They'd sold certainty for relief. And relief fades. What I didn't realize then was how fast regret turns into blame. The narrative shifted almost overnight. It wasn't panic anymore. It was miscommunication. It wasn't fear. It was lack of clarity. And somehow, quietly, insidiously, it wasn't their mistake. It was mine. She didn't speak up. She let us sell. She knew. I heard it secondhand at first. A cousin's wife. A friend of a friend. Whispers carried on the same air that once dismissed me. I felt the sting, but it didn't break me. Because the truth was simple. I had spoken up. They just hadn't listened. What I didn't realize then was that being right doesn't protect you from being resented. My sister confronted me one evening, standing in my doorway like a stranger. "Did you know this would happen?" she asked. I studied her face. The familiar lines. The worry etched deeper now. "I knew it was possible," I said. "And you didn't say anything?" "I did," I replied softly. Just not loudly enough to compete with fear. Her eyes filled with something raw. Anger. Regret. Maybe both. "We lost so much," she whispered. I nodded. "I know. But what I didn't say, what I couldn't, was that loss wasn't evenly distributed. Some of it was chosen. After she left, I sat in the dark for a long time, letting the weight of it settle, letting myself feel the loneliness that comes with being the one who waited while everyone else ran. It would have been easier to sell, to join them, to fail together. But easy choices rarely build anything worth keeping. What I didn't realize then was that the real conflict hadn't even begun. Because the dividends I collected weren't just income anymore. They were evidence. And evidence has a way of changing conversations, from what went wrong to who's responsible. The next board meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later. This time, my name was printed clearly on the agenda. Not at the bottom, near the top. And as I closed my calendar and stared at the date, one thought settled into place with unsettling clarity. They weren't inviting me to participate. They were inviting me to explain myself. And I wasn't sure yet whether I planned to be generous or honest. Continue. The morning of the meeting, I woke before my alarm. Not from anxiety, but from clarity. The kind that arrives when you finally stop trying to be understood. I dressed carefully. Nothing expensive. Nothing apologetic. Neutral colors. Clean lines. The kind of outfit that didn't beg for approval or signal defiance. Just presence. What I didn't realize then was that they'd already decided who I was before I walked in. The boardroom felt different this time. Brighter. Too bright. As if extra light could burn away discomfort. My name sat on the printed agenda, bolded unavoidable. I took my seat without greeting anyone. No one offered coffee. My brother-in-law opened the meeting with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He spoke about performance, about unexpected resilience, about lessons learned. Each phrase was carefully engineered to sound reflective without assigning blame. Then he cleared his throat. "And now," he said, folding his hands, "we'd like to hear from you." Every eye turned. I felt the pressure, not sudden but accumulated. Months of watching, of wondering, of regret fermenting into something sharper. I didn't rush. "I'm not sure what you'd like to hear," I said evenly. He leaned forward. "Your perspective. On recent outcomes. Recent outcomes. The dividends. The stability. The proof that panic had been premature." "My perspective," I repeated, "is that the company behaved exactly as it always has." A murmur rippled through the room. "You make it sound obvious," someone said. "It was," I replied. "If you were looking." Silence fell heavy. What I didn't realize then was how threatening hindsight feels when it exposes avoidable loss. Questions followed. Rapid fire. Thinly veiled accusations disguised as curiosity. "Did you anticipate the market correction? Did you expect distributions to continue? Why didn't you advise us more strongly?" Each one assumed the same thing, that I owed them foresight, that my patience was a resource they were entitled to draw from retroactively. "I advised exactly as strongly as I was allowed to," I said. "Which is to say, not at all." My sister shifted uncomfortably. "You could have spoken up," my brother-in-law insisted. "I did," I replied. "I just wasn't loud enough to interrupt certainty." The room tightened. What I didn't realize then was that certainty hates being challenged, especially by someone it once dismissed. Then came the real question, the one they'd been circling since the first dividend hit their empty accounts. "Would you consider," my brother-in-law said slowly, "redistributing some of your gains?" There it was. Not framed as a demand. Not quite a request. A test. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Resolution. "Why?" I asked. He hesitated. "For the good of the family." Family. The word echoed hollowly. "For years," I said calmly, "I was excluded from decisions made in this room. My insight wasn't requested. My caution wasn't valued. Now that patience has paid off, you're asking me to share the result. I let the silence stretch. That's not family, I continued. That's retroactive inclusion. Faces hardened. Some with guilt. Others with resentment. What I didn't realize then was that this was the moment roles finally reversed. I didn't take your shares, I said. You sold them. A few people looked away. I didn't change the policy, I went on. I read it. My brother-in-law's jaw tightened. So you're saying no? I'm saying, I replied, that consequences don't disappear just because they're uncomfortable. The meeting ended shortly after. Abruptly. No resolution. No unity restored. But as I gathered my things, something had shifted. They no longer saw me as naive. They saw me as a problem. And problems, in families like mine, were rarely left alone. The pressure escalated quickly after that. Emails questioning governance. Subtle legal language slipped into conversations. Suggestions that my holdings created imbalance. That my continued dividends were disproportionate. I read every message carefully. What I didn't realize then was that they were preparing to move against me. Not openly, but quietly. The same way they'd once excluded me. The same way they'd assumed I wouldn't notice. They were wrong. Late one night, as I reviewed documents I'd saved years ago, emails, meeting notes, policy drafts, I found it. A clause. Buried. Overlooked. A provision granting long-term shareholders specific protections. Voting weight. Dividend priority. Rights activated only after others exited. They'd forgotten it existed. I hadn't. My hands trembled slightly as I read it again. Not from fear, but from inevitability. Because in their rush to survive, they hadn't just sold shares. They'd sold leverage. And I was holding all of it. What I didn't realize then was how close we were to the moment they'd finally understand the cost of forgetting. The next letter I received wasn't a request. It was a notice. And as I read the opening line, one thought crystallized with chilling clarity. They thought they could corner me. They had no idea I'd already won. Continue. Continue. The notice was written in the kind of language people use when they want to sound reasonable while doing something deeply personal. Review of shareholder alignment. Assessment of concentration risk. Family interest preservation. Every phrase pretended this was about structure. About balance. About fairness. It wasn't. It was about control. I read the letter twice. Then a third time. Slowly. Letting every implication settle into my bones. They were proposing a temporary suspension of certain dividend privileges pending review. A pause. A cooling-off period. As if my shares were a fever that needed monitoring. I smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. What I didn't realize then, what they still hadn't realized, was that they'd already forfeited the authority to do this. I didn't respond immediately. That unsettled them more than any angry email could have. Days passed. Then a week. Follow-ups arrived, each one a little more urgent, a little less polite. They wanted dialogue, transparency, cooperation. They wanted me reactive. Instead, I prepared. I pulled out everything I'd kept over the years. Every overlooked attachment. Every forwarded memo. Every, FYI, that assumed I wouldn't read past the first paragraph. And then I scheduled a meeting of my own. Not with family. With counsel. The lawyer was younger than I expected. Calm. Thorough. Unimpressed by dramatics. She read the clause in silence, then looked up at me. They can't touch your dividends, she said simply. Not without your consent. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. Even with a board vote? I asked. She shook her head. Especially not with a board vote. This clause overrides it. Long-term holders retain priority once others divest. It's very clear. Clear. A word no one in my family had bothered to check. They forgot, I said quietly. My lawyer gave a small, knowing smile. People forget what they don't value. When I finally responded, I kept it short. Professional. Polite. Unemotional. I cited the clause. Attached documentation. Requested confirmation that all distributions would proceed as scheduled. No accusations. No commentary. Just fact. The reply came within hours. Tone completely changed. Apologetic. Corrective. Assurances that the notice had been preliminary and exploratory. That no action would be taken without full legal alignment. Alignment. I'd never felt more aligned in my life. The fallout was quieter than I expected. No dramatic confrontation. No explosive argument. Just distance. Family dinners thinned out. Invitations slowed. Conversations grew careful, guarded, as if every word were now subject to interpretation. I became something new to them. Not invisible. Not foolish. But inconvenient. What I didn't realize then was how freeing inconvenience can be. The dividends continued. Steady. Reliable. Growing. I used them carefully. Paid off my apartment. Set aside funds. Invested further, not aggressively but intentionally. The way you do when you're no longer proving anything. And still they watched. I could feel it. Waiting for me to slip. To falter. To show guilt. I showed none. Because guilt belongs to people who believe they took something. I hadn't taken anything. I'd simply stayed. Months later, my sister asked to meet me alone. We sat across from each other in a small cafe, the kind she used to love before everything became about optics and appearances. You were right, she said quietly. I didn't respond. I keep thinking, she continued, that if I'd just waited even a little. Her voice trailed off. I stirred my coffee slowly. You did what you thought you had to, I said. So did I. She nodded, eyes wet. They're angry with you. I know. They think you planned this. I met her gaze. I planned to protect myself. That's all. She looked down at her hands. Isn't that the same thing? I considered that. No, I said. The difference is intent. What I didn't say was that intent doesn't matter to people who regret their choices. As the year closed, the company stabilized fully. Quietly. Without fanfare. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd sold during the storm, only to watch calm return from the shore. And I was still there. Still collecting what they'd forgotten existed. Still holding what they couldn't get back. The final dividend of the year landed on a gray morning. I opened the statement, looked at the total, and felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Closure. Because revenge, I'd learned, isn't loud. It doesn't gloat. It simply survives long enough to be undeniable. And as they learned to live with the consequences of what they'd sold to survive, I finally understood the quiet power of what I'd chosen to keep. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.